This is the walkthrough video for PCTC 2020-21, round 1, question 7, last one standing. So we've reached the last question of this round, and so naturally it's going to be quite difficult, and yeah, it is quite difficult. It wants us to implement this really weird, confusing game. I don't really know how this is fun because it's not a game, but oh well, it wants us to implement this game. But you know, if you take this problem and break it down and decompose it into as many small steps as we can, it becomes a lot easier. So the way we're gonna solve this is we're gonna go through each of these points step by step. We're gonna do 1 or 2 lines of code at a time. And if you treat the problem like that, it becomes a lot easier to solve and a lot more manageable. So that's a good tip to remember, especially for round 2. But anyway, the first thing to do, as always, is to take our input. So we want to take a number and we want to input that many names. So let's take our number as num. Oops. And I'm going to use a list comprehension here. So let's create a list called names, and I want to input the name for as many times as our num, the first variable we inputted. And so at this point, these 2 lines of code will just get our input and get this series of names and add it to a list. So now we've dealt with our input, we can deal with the code itself, or the algorithm itself. And it says, the first bullet point, it says, the alphabetically first name in the list will be eliminated. Okay, so how do we get the alphabetically first name in a list? Well, we can sort the list alphabetically. So let's do names.sort. And what this does is it essentially just sorts the list names from the start of the alphabet to the end of the alphabet. And that naturally means that the name you want to remove, which is the first name alphabetically, is going to be the first name in the list. So that's going to be index 0. So to remove it, let's do names.pop 0. So this will just remove the first name in the list, which is going to be the first alphabetical name because of this. And it also says that name will become the eliminator name, and therefore we want to store that into a variable. And in Python, we can actually do that all in one line. So let's create a variable called eliminator, and that's going to be equal to the thing we removed. So we've removed the name and assigned the thing we've just removed to eliminator, all in one line. So that's this first bullet point done. And now we can deal with the second bullet point. So it says when a name is eliminator, the letters in a name are used one at a time in the order they occur. Okay, that sounds like a for loop to me. So let's go through every letter in the eliminator, and that is this bit of the bullet point done. And then it says to simultaneously eliminate anyone else whose name contains that letter. Okay, so this bit's a bit harder, and we'll see why. But the first thing to notice is that we need to essentially check who else's name contains that letter. So that sounds like another for loop. So let's go through every name in our list of names, and let's check if the letter we're currently looking at is in the name that we're currently looking at. And if it is, we want to eliminate name. But you can't just do this, for example, because what we're doing here is we're modifying the list names whilst also going through the list names. And Python gets confused here. So we can't tell Python in a for loop to go through every element in this list and then go ahead and change the list whilst Python is just going through it. That just really confuses it. And so we can't have this line of code, it'll throw an error. So if we can't remove the name here, well, where else can we remove it? We'll have to remove it after the for loop is done. So we'll have to remove it after this chunk of code. But we also need to know which names to remove. So what we can do is let's just create a new list. Let's call it to eliminate, and it's going to be empty. And as we come across the name that we want to eliminate, we can add it to our list to eliminate. So to eliminate dot append the name. And this way, after these 3 lines of code are done, after this for loop is done, we now have a list called to eliminate that contains every single name that we want gone. And so now we can modify names. So we want to go through every name in the list that in the list that stores the names we want to eliminate, like this. And for each of those names, we want to remove that name from the list names. So names.remove name. Perfect. So what we've done is we've essentially finished the second bullet point, right? Because we've figured out all of the names we want gone, added it to this list, then gone through this list and removed those names. And because of the nuance with Python we just discussed, we have to do it this way. Okay, and the third bullet point says, once that's done, return to the first step and repeats everything again. And so you can kind of see we want to do bullet point 1, then 2, then 3, and go back to 1, 2, 3, and so on. So it's this infinite cycle of bullet points, right? So we want to keep repeating this process. And so if we just chuck all of this into an infinite loop, so let's indent all of that, just like that. Now all of this is in this while loop, and that means all of this is just going to keep running and repeating itself. And that means we've essentially handled bullet point 3 just by putting it all in a while loop. Because all of this code is run, it's run again and again and again and so on. Okay. Oh yeah, one thing to note, this is how I like to create infinite while loops, or infinite loops in general. This is just the syntax I use. I've used it before, if you've seen my videos. Okay, so we've done the bullet points. Now there's this nuance here that says, after each letter elimination, or after a new eliminator is chosen, the game can end if either of these two conditions are met. So there are two cases where the game can end. Let's cover them by case basis. So the first case we're going to look at is after a new eliminator is chosen. And that's going to be right here on line 7, a new eliminator is chosen. And what's the condition? Well, the conditions are if only one name remains or if no names remain. So let's check. If len names is equal to 1, so if there's only one name left, then let's print off the winner, which is going to be, well, it's going to be the only name that's left in this list. And by nature of it being a list, the only name that's left is going to be the name at index 0. And this also means the game is done. So let's break out of this infinite loop. So this infinite loop is essentially our game, and breaking out of this loop suggests that our game is done. Or the alternative condition is that len names is equal to 0, so no names left, and that means it wants us to print no result. And then again, our game is finished, so let's break out of our loop because our game is done. Okay, and the second condition, or the second case where we want to check whether the game is done or not, is after each letter elimination. And each letter elimination occurs in this chunk of code. So that means after this last for loop is done, remember this is the for loop where we removed the names themselves. So after this for loop is done, then we want to check whether the game is done. So let's just go ahead and copy that code from earlier, paste it there and indent it correctly so it's within this loop. And this checks that the game is done once all of our names are eliminated for a given letter. But you may notice an issue here. This break statement will actually only break out of this for loop because breaks only break out of one loop. This break breaks out of this for loop. But this is actually meant to break out of the entire thing, right? Because it suggests the entire game is done. And if the entire game is done, then we want to break out of the entire infinite loop. We want to break out of this loop. So this is a slight issue. And so to do that, to combat that issue, which is relatively common in Python, we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to assign this at the start of our loop, and let's just call it ended, and let's set it to 0 initially. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if either of these conditions are met, that means the game has ended. And so let's change our ended variable to be equal to 1. And what that does is it means, well, firstly, we've broken out of this for loop, and so that means we're now at this level of indentation. But it also means we want to end the game, so it means we want to break out of the entire while loop, the infinite loop. And so at the end of the loop itself, we can just check if ended is equal to 1. And if it is, that means that the game has ended and we want to break out of the entire thing. Let's do that here. So what we've done is we've essentially broken out of 2 levels of loops by using this variable to keep track of whether we want to or not. And remember, the important thing is we also define the variable at the start of the loop, and we reset it to 0 every time the loop runs. That bit doesn't really matter, but we need to ensure we define the variable, otherwise Python will throw an error if the variable doesn't exist. Okay, and I believe this is everything covered. So we've covered the 3 bullet points in order. Then we've covered this caveat, and we've covered the inputs. Yep, and we've covered the outputs. Yep. And so all we have to do is submit the code, and hopefully it gets us all the points. But yeah, this is a pretty difficult problem, and I think just remember the idea that if you ever come across a tough problem, you can decompose it into a series of smaller steps, and eventually the steps will become pretty easy. Like I'm sure you all know how to set a variable. I'm sure you all know how to create a loop, right? So it's all about taking this big problem and splitting up into as many small steps as possible and tackling each of those steps one by one. And that makes harder problems much easier to solve. Um, but there are still like harder concepts in this. For example, this infinite loop concept, or this concept of double breaking out of loops, of nested loops. So I would say if you're still a bit unsure about how this works, copy across the code. The link to the code is in the GitHub below. Um, and if you copy it across, then you can kind of change the different variables, so you can print things out and you can debug it or whatever. You can just play around and experiment with my code. Um, and now we can kind of get a better feel for how it works, and hopefully get a better understanding of all of the concepts we've mentioned so far. And once you've understood them, then you can apply them to your own coding and hopefully become a stronger coder. Um, but yeah, that concludes the series for this PCTC series. So if you're doing PCTC this year, I wish you the very best of luck. And hopefully I'll see you in the round 2 videos.